This is another lecture covering chapters in the textbook. The book is Information Security Risk Assessment Toolkit, and today we're going to go through chapter 4. Let's look again at the basic risk model, because as we're gathering data and analyzing data, we need some sort of model or framework, perhaps, to hang our data on, to organize it, to help us elucidate relationships with the data, and to come up with the results we want, which is the results that tell us exactly what countermeasures, what types of countermeasures, and how much we need to budget and allocate for these countermeasures. We start here with a threat. A threat is something that may cause harm to IT assets. A threat agent is the active entity that is attacking your assets. The vulnerability is a lack of a safeguard that a threat can exploit. It's some weakness in your defense that allows the threat or threat agent to actually cause harm. Now, in order to determine the impact, we have to look at both the threat-vulnerability pair, how likely it is, and what is a mechanism for the threat agent to cause destruction, and the value of the asset. Massive destruction calls that relates to an asset having very small value isn't as much as, say, a small incident involving an asset with very great value. An exposure is an event that may occur causing damage and destruction. So it's the impact of the threat vulnerability on the asset. We have countermeasures. Some countermeasures are already in place, existing controls, and some are the ones that our threat analysis is going to recommend we implement to further strengthen our ability to counteract the threat. The countermeasures are measures that reduce the impact of a risk, either by reducing the likelihood of the threat exploiting the vulnerability or reducing the exposure of the asset value, given that an attack takes place. What we have left over after all this is residual risk. There is no way to 100% prevent an attack, and to prevent loss, there is always some amount of risk that you have to live with. The residual risk is the risk remaining after all feasible security countermeasures are applied. Implementing this model requires discovering or calculating the values of each component of the model. So we have to look at, who are the threat agents, what are the feasible threats out there, some characteristics of the threats, what is the goal of the threat agent, what sort of resources do they have at their disposal, how do they take risks, what areas do they take risks in and not take risk. Certain threat agents are very risk averse. In other cases, certain threat agents really don't care. We need to look at the vulnerabilities. What are the possible vulnerabilities? Catalog places where we may have vulnerabilities and check to see whether they really exist or not. We need some way of determining the asset value, not just in dollars of cents, but value in terms of intangibles, qualitative things like number of records of personally identifiable information that could be compromised, potential disruption to the business, publicity value, bad publicity in case your company gets attacked and it gets in the news, loss of customers, etc., all figures into the asset value. We have to look at the impact of a threat event. If the threat agent exploits a vulnerability, how much of the asset value will they get away with? Can they compromise all of it? Generally not. They usually compromise some part of it, an aspect of the value or some portion of the asset. And then what's the likelihood of the agent being able to exploit the vulnerability? Is the vulnerability something where they can just walk in the door? Does it require some sort of prerequisite? Do they need to go after an employee to get some secret information like a password in order to get in, etc.? The events that must take place in order for the threat to exploit the vulnerability have a certain probability and a certain effort associated with them. Then we look at the existing countermeasures or controls that can mitigate the impact. What program do you have to mitigate vulnerabilities, to lessen the exposure of asset value, to prevent threat agents from attacking your organization, recovering if an attack actually occurs, mitigating the damage when something happens, etc. These are all countermeasures. And then we're left with net risk. We need to collect and organize the data for each of these, and this is what this chapter is about. It's actually more about the analysis than the collection. Now, collecting and organizing this data to support the risk model includes compiling data from prior risk assessments. You generally in an organization don't walk in and have this being the first time you've done this work. Somebody has done something like this before, maybe years before, and even if it's a very old risk assessment, it's still worthwhile to look at what they found. You need to prepare the threat catalog. You need to look at feasible threats out there that could exploit a vulnerability and cause harm to you. Figure out who these threats are, how they behave, what resources they have, what skill levels, what sort of financing. Are they able to evade legal jurisdictions easily? Are they offshore in a place that doesn't really enforce the law? Are they threat agents that have insider information? Are they nation states? Are they other corporations? Are they criminal gangs, etc.? That's your catalog of threats. You also need to prepare the vulnerability catalog. What are the types of vulnerabilities that could occur in your organization and which ones actually exist? You might want to scan your network to see if you've got exposed services that are vulnerable, look at audit reports, see if there are control failures or procedural failures that someone could exploit, and so forth. You then design the impact analysis scheme and the control analysis scheme. What is the potential impact given the threat catalog and vulnerability, and what are the controls we have in place? And in the likelihood analysis scheme, pulling it all together and coming up with a final risk score. And I want to emphasize that by score, there's not usually some sort of magical quantitative measure that tells you exactly how much is at risk. It may just be a high, medium, or low type of score, or a rank ordering of risks. But regardless, these are all useful scores in terms of guiding management decisions for implementing security. Now, compiling data from prior risk assessments. There's all kinds of different assessments that you can look at, and you need to think very broadly about these. Prior security risk assessments. Somebody before you has been doing what you're doing now. Audit reports. You have an external auditor, a PricewaterhouseCoopers. Somebody is required to audit your financial statements and also looks at your internal control environment. You may have internal auditors. Most large companies have an internal audit department that regularly reviews controls and sometimes security over systems. You can have assessments that are driven by regulatory requirements. Do you handle credit cards? In that case, the payment card industry requires that you have certain periodic assessments. Do you provide services, data processing services or IT services to other entities? In that case, your organization is subject to an SSAE 16, a type of audit report. And then likewise, if you use the service of somebody like an Amazon cloud service provider or a SunGuard or something, what SSAE 16 reports have they provided you? What controls do they implement? They're part of your environment. That, as a third party, that's why you get these reports. Vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. Are there network scans that are performed to look at vulnerable services within your internal and external networks? Have you hired a technical firm to do a full-on penetration test? These results are often very useful. Look at your current policies, procedures, and standards. And don't forget the facilities, folks. Facility security plans and facility security programs are very important. Many attacks against ICT resources involve some sort of physical presence or on-site presence in order to complete the actual attack to have the full impact. So current policies, procedures, and standards, facilities, policies, procedures, standards, all weigh in, particularly with the existing countermeasures, but can also give you clues as to the threat environment and potential vulnerabilities. Just because something says here is a set of security controls we have doesn't mean the information is limited to controls. You can infer other things, like if they wrote up this list of controls, they must be concerned about a particular type of threat, or there may be certain types of vulnerabilities that are driving these controls that they want to compensate for. So read between the lines. Disaster recovery, business impact analysis, business contingency plans. Disaster recovery folks do a very good job of looking at the criticality of assets. How long can you survive if a certain application, if a server, if a network connection is down? And what do you need to do? How much do you need to allocate in order to maintain that service if it goes down? So it's a very good place, for one, what is the impact of an outage? And two, what is it worth to keep this particular service going? Some services, it may not be worth anything. It's like it goes down. It's actually cheaper to let it be down for a while than it is to try to recover it. But it's this cost-benefit analysis that's implied in a lot of the DR documentation that's really important. IT inventories, stuff, software licenses, services, your CMDB. That is good just for the inventory, as well as telling you what versions of stuff do you have, where is it located, and again, look at this with a critical eye and try to infer possible vulnerabilities, possible assets that a threat agent could want to attack. Org charts and staff listings. Also look at contractors and consultants as well. They may not be in the official org chart, but they play an important role. When you're looking at policies, procedures, and standards, notice how well they're maintained. Are there gaps in scope? Compare your security policies to standards like ISO 27000. Are there things that the standards recommend that you don't have, that are missing? Are there policies that are clearly outdated? These are possible vulnerabilities. Not having a policy in a certain significant area is a potential risk, because it means that area isn't being managed and you probably don't have effective countermeasures. At best, you have ad hoc controls. At worst, it's just a big gaping black hole. This data should all go beyond prior risk assessments. It should include, you should look at planning and operational data that's relevant to security risk analysis. Maybe look at IT budgets, maybe look at security programs and other programs that affect the security environment. Maybe look at new applications that are in the process of being implemented, because those new applications may present vulnerabilities or may support IT assets that you didn't have before. When compiling data from prior risk assessments, here's some things to look at. Findings and facts relevant to that assessment, the description of what's done and the systems being assessed, including the detailed narrative backing up findings. Don't just look at the bullet points. Look at the detail. Here is why this is a finding. The scope of the assessment. What did they look at? What did they exclude? What sort of things maybe it didn't exist at the time of the assessment you have now? And in how the information was obtained, because you may be able to get updated information from the same source, but also if you know something about your organization, you may realize that the source that this prior assessment relied on is weak in certain areas. Maybe they interviewed a bunch of people who are very familiar with your server environment, but since then you've gone off to cloud-based support and there's nothing there in the prior assessment covering this. And the folks running the cloud-based provisioning program weren't part of the original server team. Now, preparing the threat catalog. You're going to be doing this as part of your assignment following NIST SP 830. But if you're doing this in a real war, this is basically a comprehensive list of threats relevant to your organization. And I need to underline relevant to your organization. It just hurts your credibility if you include off-the-wall threats and can't justify them as being relevant to the organization. It's hard enough to convince skeptical upper management that something is a real threat could possibly be something you want to guard against. It's going to be absolutely impossible if you're just taking stuff off a checklist and you don't even know why this thing should be on a threat list, or you can't articulate why. There are some existing comprehensive lists that you can rely on to build these. Don't start from scratch. The bits calculator is mentioned in the textbook. Good luck finding this one. I did a real good search. If you guys want to shine in this class, figure out where this thing is and tell everyone about it. You won't get any extra credit, but you'll make a lot of friends. Microsoft's threat model, the documentation of their particular threat analysis tool involving Stride and Dread, also includes a pretty good list of threats. In this SP 800 Appendix D and F, this is what I suggest you use for the class project. These are actually pretty decent. D has the threats. I believe F pertains more to vulnerabilities, but is also useful for threats. ISO 27005 Appendix C. Here is a link to a PDF to find this thing. And in the BSI Base IT Security Manual, this is a German manual here, as you can tell by the top-level domain.de. And this is also a good set of threats. The threat catalog should include at least potential threat agent and the actions they may undertake to realize a threat. How do these threat agents typically behave? Or if the threat is not an intentional threat, if it's errors and omissions, or if it's a natural disaster or an infrastructure failure, what are the potential failure mechanisms, or what are the potential events that define the realization of this threat? Preparing the vulnerability catalog. You want a comprehensive list of vulnerabilities relevant to your organization, known and verified, and potential and hypothetical. Because if you have potential and hypothetical vulnerabilities, these are things you should look for. You should at least be able to say outright there is no evidence this vulnerability is out there, as opposed to ignoring it. ISO 27005 Appendix D is a good source for this. NIST SP 830 Appendix F will help you guide you on this, though it's not as good as the threat one. And then what you want to do when you prepare the vulnerability catalog is start thinking about pairing vulnerabilities with threats. If you know something about the behavior and preferences of a threat agent, what do they exploit? Certain criminal organizations, really try to exploit using phishing attacks on insider resources. They will try to target a malicious email and then send it specifically to system administrators and executives, hoping that they'll click the link and infect their desktop machine. And as the intro, this is the way certain threat agents behave, and you want to look into that. And you want to, if you have that agent, pair it up. This involves a certain amount of research. You need to know, well, given that this threat agent behaves in this way, here are some vulnerabilities they could use. The impact analysis scheme. Given our system inventory, what's the potential impact if an element is compromised? We're looking at assets and we're looking at impact. If the threat takes advantage of a vulnerability, what are we out? What do we lose? Go through the data associated with each element and estimate the level of confidentiality, integrity, availability. Classify the data. And if you have a good organization that's really diligent about security, they may have done this already, but it doesn't hurt to follow up and quantify this a bit more, define it in more detail. They may say this data is classified as company confidential, but it's good for you to understand why this is and what specifically is there that gives it that rating. A determination matrix is a table defining these levels. So it's basically, given a certain level, what are the characteristics that give it a certain classification. When you're looking at an impact analysis, it's called the high watermark criteria. It's a certain pool of data may have data that's classified low, medium, and high, but you always use the high watermark, the highest level of classification. And note that when we're doing this impact analysis, the elements can be a database, application, server, network, resource, or process. Design a control analysis scheme. What controls are in place to reduce the frequency or impact of a threat? Use the control survey to enumerate these. Rate each control's effectiveness. And, again, you can't say, well, this control will eliminate 95% of all possible attacks. You can use low, medium, and high. Certain controls might discourage, a not very determined or not very intelligent attacker, but so to that extent, it's effective. But if it won't deter somebody who actually knows what they're doing, then it's not completely effective. Multiple controls may control the same vulnerability. If you have a patching program in place for your servers, that will control a large number of vulnerabilities having to do with server operating systems, application software, and basic configurations. Distinguish primary versus secondary controls. Some controls are targeted against a specific vulnerability. Some are targeted against other vulnerabilities, but by the way, also affect this other one as a secondary control. And then note the cumulative impact of all controls. This is where you get into defense in depth. You should have multiple controls, and control B should be able to control against or reduce the impact of an event if control A fails. The control should have different criteria for operating so that if one fails, the other one can be expected to hold up. You're mapping controls to vulnerability and determining the extent of vulnerability's impact is reduced. So it goes threat, vulnerability, and then control analysis. And in the middle there is impact, which is your metric for determining how effective the control is. The likelihood analysis scheme is how likely or probable that a threat may exploit a vulnerability. In some cases, it's not really a likelihood, it's a certainty. And the only question is, how often is this attack going to take place? Certain types of internet attacks can be counted on to occur very, very frequently. If you drop your firewall, you may find within a matter of minutes that your internal network is compromised because there are folks out there scanning constantly. Likelihood is one thing I've found that non-technical management tends not to understand. They tend to have a mindset that if something's hard to do, it can't. If they think something is hard to do, it can't happen that often. And this is where actually collecting metrics as to who is scanning your network, how many viruses are found that are remediated by your antivirus software, that sort of stuff can be very enlightening. You can also look at third-party, industry-type statistics. This is how often phishing attacks typically happen. This is how often that attack happens. When you have some major sort of vulnerability that's publicly announced, like the Heartbleed vulnerability, within a matter of days you had folks actively scanning the internet. And if you can report back saying, we've been scanned this many times from these addresses, that will really drive home that this is a high likelihood threat. Anyway, so much for that. The likelihood is related to the exposure of the asset to the threat. Something that's behind multiple firewalls is less exposed to an external threat. Something that is a system that is only used by a handful of users is less exposed to an attack that involves password sniffing, for example, than one that has thousands of users. What is the frequency of threat events? And this is where your research really helps. And then what are the mitigating controls? How many of these threat events do we prevent? People scanning you against your outside firewall is a threat event, but your firewall should be blocking this stuff. And then for the final risk score, we synthesize all this, and we now have a matrix that has the following elements. It has threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, and impact. Don't go too nuts on the matrix here. It's very easy because there's a lot of many-to-many relationship here to come up with huge spreadsheets. Just focus on the main relationships for now. What you want to do is throttle down the main things that you need to remediate and work on in your organization. And in controls. When we have calculated a final risk score, we have a more interesting result, which is a set of relationships between the components of the risk model. And there we go.